Oh, this is great. Yeah, I mean, once Orlando shares his screens, I mean, you're going to see that we get a chance to welcome you to practical tips for church budgeting. I mean, Orlando and I are glad to be here to explore the ideas and plans for budgeting for your congregation. So, like Maggie said, kudos to you if you've been here for all three sessions. You know what? I was, and in the previous sessions, I saw such a good use of the chat feature. I mean, friends, in this Zoom, there's so much collective wisdom. So feel free to share your tips with one another on what works for you as things come up. And it's nice because you get to toggle that chat to either show it or hide it, whatever your preference might be. And so, as Maggie said earlier, you can address your question. You can put out those questions, and she'll curate them for the end of our presentation. So it's good to be with you all.
So today we're going to cover, as Maggie mentioned, some church budgeting. We thought it would be important to begin our time together after a brief introduction of who we are with looking at the context, things that you should consider when preparing your budget, and that's both the income and expense sides of your budget. We're going to continue that conversation by looking at the different types of budgets that are used within congregations, and then we're going to end our time together talking more about the narrative budget. The narrative budget has been covered in brief in some of the earlier presentations today, so we're just going to go a little bit deeper as time will allow. And of course, as we have said in each presentation, each ministry relations officer for your area is happy to continue these conversations that we're not able, of course, to get to if we run out of time. So starting with the introduction, my name is Olanda Carr. I am the Minister Relations Officer of the East Region from the Presbyterian Foundation. East Region means I start at Delaware and go all the way down to South Carolina and have the states in between there. And I go a little bit to the west with West Virginia. I've been with the foundation almost 10 years. Time has really flown. And we work, of course, in all the areas of stewardship that you have heard about already today. I have the pleasure of working with my colleague, Jonah So, and I will let him introduce himself at this time.
Hi, all. I'm Jonah So. I serve as the pastor of Arcola Covenant Community in Paramus, New Jersey. While that's currently, that is the current context is the UMC, my previous call was with the Peace USA congregation for 17 years. I am also a minister of diversity, equity, and inclusion for this Presbyterian Foundation. Olanda says he was with it for 10 years. With COVID, I feel like maybe I'm the same. I mean, I don't know how long it's been, but it's been a pleasure to work together with Olanda and with the foundation. And now that you know a little bit about us, we're not complete strangers speaking to you. Let's take a look at the session agenda. We're going to go into the context. The item 2 is the principles of church budgeting, and so we want to, what we have here is, with the context, you want to assess where you are and to make a relevant and doable budget, right? Relevant and doable. And we'll review 9 things to consider as you prepare for your budget.
And as Joan has mentioned, these things we believe are universal. We're going to cover different items or different types of budgeting processes as we go through today. But regardless of the type that is in use at your church, we believe that these 9 items should still be relevant in your context. For one, we're going to talk about financial well-being. It sounds simple, but one of the most simple things that we can look at with the budget is, truthfully, do not spend more than you're bringing in. Often we deal with congregations that, of course, deal with some deficit spending and deficit budgeting. And we recognize that, say, for instance, last year, as Jonah mentioned, being a COVID year, that may have occurred. And you're going to have those circumstances. That is definitely something that is going to happen from time to time. However, that should not be something that happens consistently year over year. Having a pattern of spending more than you bring in will certainly come back to haunt you in the long run.
Right, right. Well, of course, God will provide, but this is practical. And what we're doing is the second item we want to look at is annual expenses. It's very simple. We want to set aside money every month for an annual bill. I mean, these expenses are not a surprise. Some examples include salaries, insurance, worship, and the programs, and denominational contributions. So these are expenses that you know are coming. And so because you know it and it's not a surprise, we're able to take some and put it aside and have it ready.
Absolutely. We also need to look at similarly our income projections. We're going to talk about how we review our year over year on both expenses and in income as we go through today. But basic questions: how much money actually came in last year? What did we look like from an income month over month type of income receipt? Are we on an upward or downward trend going into the next year? Trend analysis is something that definitely helps me as I work with my own church in this context. I try my best to at least look at 5 years and look at those trends year over year and see how that is going. Trends can tell us a lot. They are definitely things that are outliers, again, the pandemic, but often we can use those trends to be a really effective way to predict what is to come.
Right. And as we look at the income projections, the next thing we want to look at is the expense projections. What we want to do is we want to overestimate which is going out. We want to anticipate annual increases in costs that we can't control, right? I mean, if you're in the Northeast, snow removal has been relatively light for the past few years, but in the past month, it caught up a lot, right? And so what we want to do is we want to make this larger so that we can offset the surprise, right? But even with the snow, let's say we have these non-gatherings at church, which made me said, hey, we don't need to clear out the parking lot. Nonetheless, when we overestimate our expenses, we reduce the possibility of being surprised. And the development and training of leaders and promotion are other areas that are often overlooked when people prepare these projections.
We also want to look at our seasonal fluctuations. A few moments ago, I was talking about the importance of trending. Often when you're looking at those trends, you don't just look at the year end or the bottom line total. You would also be wise to look at the trends within the year. Some churches, of course, have a summertime slump. Some churches, some of the churches in my area, for instance, have the snowbird type of thing, where many of their members will leave during the winter months. And so summer is often not a slump, but often a period of when their revenue comes in the most. Whatever your trend is, definitely spend time looking at that, looking at it if you can, in an ideal scenario, month over month for that 5-year period. Compare, for instance, a January for the last 4 Januaries, et cetera. And that can certainly help you. There is definitely an ebb and flow to our attendance. Often that is related to giving. My colleagues before us this afternoon talked about online giving. Often that helps with the ebb and flow in attendance, of course, because that allows our members to give even when they're not there physically. And we certainly had a crash course in that last year. But looking at those fluctuations, again, is very important.
Yeah, right. I mean, church attendance goes up in Easter and Christmas, and so and so speaking of the obvious, item 6 is start an emergency fund, right? I mean, no matter how little we have coming in, we need to create a line item to create a fund to cover emergencies, because that's what it is. You don't know what the emergency will be, but emergencies happen, and by having a fund ready, again, you will not be surprised. You will be in a place to handle that emergency when it comes.
Absolutely. And related to that is ongoing building maintenance, the dreaded building fund, capital improvements fund, all kinds of things that I have heard when working with congregations. But the bottom line, deferred maintenance is definitely not something we would like to encourage. Having a way to handle things as they come up. Because just like our homes, if we defer maintenance, the longer we defer it, often the price tag to correct that issue goes up and up and up. So having a way to prepare for that, one of the things that I have the joy and luxury of along on the East Coast side, I know Maggie said West Coast is the best coast, but on the East Coast side, I have just the privilege of seeing so many congregations that were started just hundreds and hundreds of years ago. East Coast, I'm sorry, Maggie, but this is where it all started, right? And so having these congregations and all these churches that have just wonderful sanctuaries, well, often as our buildings age, as we know, the maintenance to care for those buildings definitely increases. And so having a way, just ignoring it will not make it go away. Having a way to address those concerns as they come up is certainly something that your budget should allow for.
And just to add to that, anecdotally, I remember my former congregation received a building. We rented, and then we were able to move into a building, and we're so happy about it. And we were like, oh, we have so many funds that was saved up for the building fund to purchase, but now we don't have to purchase. We just simply get a building. Wow. And then all that money, more than $1 million, went into the remodel and the restoration of the building, because of what Olanda said, deferred maintenance. And we're just shocked at how quickly the money went away. And so that's definitely something. And then when the money was going away, people were like, hey, what's going on, budget? And it went into this. That leads us into number 8. Design the budget with the people who have a stake in it. The people in your congregation, right? The smaller the church, the more important it is to seek the input and wisdom from the people who are doing ministry. Those engaged in the worship, education, outreach ministries, the building and grounds, what's going on. They know what is happening. And to have that input as the budget is being created helps us have a better view of what goes on in the church.
Absolutely. We began our time today with my colleagues, Stephen and Gail. They were talking about the importance of how you approach stewardship in general. And one of those concepts talks about having the input of others on a well-rounded approach. For too many years, we left our stewardship and our budgeting functions to the financial wizards of our congregation. Those were really good at adding things on a calculator or spreadsheet, et cetera. But having the input of those that are actually doing the ministry is really important as you are devising your budget, and you'll see why as we go through our presentation. Factor finances into how you do ministry, not if. We have a saying at the foundation that our members give to ministry. We don't give for lawn maintenance, electricity, carpeting, all the things that we like to harp on often at congregational meetings or when we're having our finance discussions around the session table. We give to ministry. We come to church to be part of something larger than ourselves. It is important for us to remember that when we're developing our budget. Sometimes we have a way of seeing what we have and then deciding what ministry we will do. And when you get in that pattern, you find yourself just cutting out stuff constantly. And so it's not a helpful pattern. It's something that was referenced earlier with that scarcity mentality. It's best for us to look at how we will do ministry, not if. And it was something that Jonah and I believe so much that you're going to see it again. Factor finances into how you do ministry, just in larger font. I can't say that enough, and I will say that again as we go through, that ministry is definitely the leading voice of what we're doing today.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. I'm so glad that we get to see that twice. The how, right? Into how, not if. I mean, that's something great. And having these 9 general principles and reviewing these allows us to now move forward into the third point of our session, um, which is the budget classifications, right? The types, the budget classifications, and these again, the 9 principles, we look at the type of budget classifications.
Yes, and as we go through our budget classifications in a few moments, what you are going to find most likely, if you're like me and Jonah and others who work with budgeting within your context, you're going to see yourself kind of a little bit in all of these types. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You're going to see elements probably of what you do zero-based and elements that are program-based. That is perfectly fine. The encouragement that we have is just, of course, as you're going through and hearing about these types of budgeting, to make sure you're being faithful to the spirit of what that type is seeking to do. Each type has a certain focus, a certain desired objective of the type. And so it's perfectly fine to combine the types, but just make sure as you're combining and developing your own hybrid approach, that you are definitely incorporating the good and not really the bad, but the opportunities, I guess, with each type. Another thing I wanted to mention that our colleague Gail mentioned earlier, regardless of the type of budget that you adopt within your congregation, it is extremely important to be transparent. These are not scientific experiments happening in a lab. They were not shared with members of your congregation. We all know our book of order. We all know who approves a budget. We all know terms of calls. I will not insult your intelligence in that area, but it is important to be able to be transparent with the numbers and the finances with members. Sometimes when we are looking at these different types, some folks say, well, if I do a narrative, I'm hiding things from the members, et cetera. And that is not the case. You never want to hide where you are. If anything, having a more transparent view of your budget helps you. I mentioned a few moments ago, and again, I will keep mentioning about giving to ministry, but having the ministry tell the story of the budget is what we're after, but definitely telling that story and being very transparent with how you tell that story is extremely important.
Yeah, and I love that we're going to able to present to you 4 of those types that we just saw there. And the first type that we want to consider is zero-based budgeting. Here's a little fun fact. It's used by it says here executive, but I think it's the legislative branch of government uses it, right? And what this simply means is that all the ministry areas are reduced to 0 each year. And this is because every ministry area must justify their expense requests. Now, this can be time consuming. And as soon as you hear that, if you're pastor, church, like, oh man, right? But I mean, yes, time consuming. However, the method is useful as it encourages ministries to be regularly reviewed. Creativity and imagination are sometimes overlooked factors, and they have a place here, right? The process helps to promote focus on the mission and the purpose of the congregation to determine whether or to add or eliminate funds. So the zero-based budgeting is great and has a positive, yes, time consuming, but it has a positive for what it allows us to think and be creative and see why we want to do and what things we can possibly do, what things we should do.
Absolutely. And that really complements the next style, which is program budgeting. As Jonah mentioned, it is important for us, regardless of style selected, to regularly review the ministry areas of the congregation. And program budgeting, that really takes front and center. Really reviewing the ministry area just to make sure that area is still being effective. Each ministry area is reviewed, including the needs, and evaluating it again for effectiveness. You're looking at the target for the upcoming year. That target is often related, of course, to the income sources, as well as looking at the needs. And as I mentioned, it is kind of a combination approach when you're looking at that. A program budget, at least what I have seen many do recently, it's really been helpful as we're looking at coming out of the pandemic. What we did most likely in 2019 took a very different view in 2020. So areas such as maybe our outreach ministries or our Christian ed ministries, et cetera, we had to change that. We had to change the way we conducted Bible study. We had to change the way maybe we did outreach activities within the community. And so you're really looking at that type of thing. Now, of course, that was a pretty major event, preferably not to happen in that magnitude again within our lifetimes, but each year there are going to be circumstances that will cause us to evaluate what will we do in this particular ministry area. What I have seen in many churches, that looks like a meeting of that unit, whether it's the end of the year or the beginning of the following year, where you just sit down and do some calendar planning. What would we like to do? How do we estimate the costs of what we are trying to do? And how does that relate again to the larger picture of the budget? But again, the ministry area and its effectiveness is one of the most significant things about this type.
We come to the third budget type, which is incremental or line item budgeting. This is based on the previous year's expenditures, right? It makes adjustments to each item for anticipated cost increases or activity changes. And what we find is this is the most popular among churches, right? And I'm not surprised, because it's the simplest and it's user friendly. And we could take a look as to why. When we look at the next slide, we'll see that the line item budget, it's an accounting tool. It's a useful tool that helps us see things. It assigns expenses into categories, usually using number coding, and it's usually presented in grid or spreadsheet form. So you could take a look right here. There's an example of the template, and what this allows us to do is just use the numbers from the previous year to determine what the new budget will be. It makes it simple in the sense that we're going to increase the budget by 5%. Boom, you can see and the numbers that you can change for that, or you want to decrease it, do the same thing. Again, it's a useful tool, and this makes it easy. Just like pros and cons, one of the things that this allows us to do is that, oh, we did this last year. And I know that some of you realize that could be the kiss of death of ministry. Oh, we did this, right? The creativity, the imagination goes out. But when we're talking about time and something that needs to get put together, something like this becomes useful. And as Olanda mentioned, when we have an off year like COVID, what it does, what happened last year has nothing to do with this. So, but for the most part, line item again becomes simple, and that is why many churches use this version.
Exactly, Jonah. And as I mentioned, when we started looking at the different classifications, that many find it helpful to combine approaches. What I see mostly with the line item approach is definitely looking at the program effectiveness that we just talked about in the previous slides, but also, of course, weighing that with that year over year trend. As Jonah mentioned, we can't get stuck and just say we did it last year, we're going to do it exactly the same next year. And so with the hybrid approach, you are able to say, what are the objectives for each ministry area? How will that impact what we did last year? Will it be completely different, or will it be very similar? Sometimes, as far on the pro side, the area that you can see there that's highlighted, administration. Administration is often one of those that perhaps you can look at year over year, and maybe is not as subject to the visioning exercises of, say, the Christian ed unit that you see right below. So when you're looking at line item approach, or really any of the approaches that we're covering today, and definitely finding yourself most likely in a hybrid model, it's very important, again, to look at the goals and vision for each unit, and definitely determining how that would look year over year. We're going to contrast line item versus narrative and go to the narrative budget in the next section. Prior to doing that, we're going to just do a side by side of how you would look at the two. Now, before I even go through this list, what generally happens, and probably what should happen, is that you see at the last bullet point on the left side is that a line item budget should be used by your session. I never want to suggest or imply that you don't do some type of budgeting system where you're looking at the particulars of what you're spending in each category. That is something that we sign up for as session members when we are looking at how we are going to be leaders of the church and we're sitting around that session table. We have to be aware of those expenses, aware of sources of income and all of those good things. However, often it's not helpful for that to be the lead message for the congregation. Probably if Maggie's helping me keep count, for the 50th time, I'm going to say that our members give to ministry. And so as our members are giving to ministry, a line item budget is going to kind of hide that. And so what we are going to talk about in the slides that follow is how a narrative budget is more of a visioning tool, how it shows that programs of the church are having a positive impact on how they are making a difference, hopefully, in the community and in the world. It's inspiring, helping our members see that their gifts really make a difference. And it helps our numbers to be refrained to be about ministry. That is what we are trying to do. I believe in one of the earlier presentations, there was a comment about how we do our giving statements and how often those go out. Well, when we send those out, we're hopefully able to tell a story with those statements. So it's less like a Visa statement, but more of a story about how we are connecting those dollars to ministry. And that is what the narrative approach will do. But often it will be a complement to the line item or zero or program budget, because those may or may not show how the money is being invested or show how the volunteer time and talents are impacting the church. And so that is why we often encourage that narrative approach. So without further ado, we will go towards that approach, which is the section we will spend a little bit more time with as we get to the last part of our presentation about what the narrative budget is. A narrative budget, a little quote, a great word doesn't matter if it isn't being seen and heard. And so keep that in mind, because often the best tools of ministry are being hidden in our spreadsheets. And so we're trying to unhide that, unhide those mysteries, and let our members really see what we are working on as a church in the area and how we are furthering, of course, the mission of Jesus Christ.
Let's take a look at this definition. A narrative budget is a representation of the line item budget in simple, easy to read, descriptive terms. It transforms a line item of money and expenses into an exciting picture of ministries and missions of the congregation. That's what gets me excited about this narrative budget. Because, like I shared previously, while the line item budget is a tool for those who know how to use it, it's sort of confounding for those who don't know how to use it. And so this narrative budget really makes it accessible for people, especially in our congregation, to see these stories and see what's happening.
Absolutely. And while you are asking yourself, well, gosh, what is our story? Well, sometimes that is where you start, literally. A narrative is only effective if you're able to articulate what is your story. When I am able to meet with churches and a presentation in the good old days of when we could do that and face to face, this is one of my favorite questions, because what I will often do around a table is ask those in attendance, what is your story? What is it that you do well in the church or in the community? And how are you participating with Jesus Christ? And I can watch eyes light up in the room as members began telling stories of food pantries and stories of their outreach ministry and perhaps of the history of the church and how long they have been there involved in one ministry or another. And as you are listening to those stories, especially when I'm doing that as a kind of facilitator role, I'm able to glean from that their story. And often they have never even thought about it. I'm able to say, well, gosh, it sounds like to me that you all are bound by this thread of really being service to your community. And that seems to be a really important thing for your congregation. I'm noticing the stories that you share really are, knitted together with that type of fiber. And so that is why this is definitely a good exercise to do. I encourage my churches to do this often around the session table and within a stewardship meeting. Of course, if you're small enough or able to do it among the congregation, that's great too. But just being able to ask folks, what is it? What is it that you believe that we do well? And it's not a way of boasting. Again, that's why that second question is very important. Is really connecting that ministry to the overall mission of how we are participating in the mission and ministry of Jesus Christ. And so we don't just do things because we're nice people. We do things because they're connected to our overall ministry and mission. So being able to do that is equally as important of how we connect everything that we do to that.
So why do we tell our story, right? The story is told to connect to the mission or the plan of the church, why we're here. It's told to raise awareness about the church. Sometimes if you're in the church, you think everyone knows, but as it was said previously, it's not like church has a marketing department, and it lets everyone know what's going on. Sometimes a lot of things are done quietly behind the scenes and subtly. And we tell the story to raise awareness about what's happening, so then we can what? Celebrate our church. And it creates energy about the church, and then it allows us then to invite people to engage in the church. Olanda said people's eyes light up. I mean, I remember the opposite, just people's eyes glazing over once the finances were discussed, numbers were discussed, just grid of numbers up on the screen or in our pamphlet, and people just talking and just what, and just totally zoning out. But it's so different when we tell a story. Now people are engaging, their heads are coming in, like, what's going on? And they're all eager to hear what's happening. And that's why we tell the story.
Absolutely. How do we tell our story? This slide should look familiar to you, as my colleague, I believe Stephen, shared this one earlier. I just added the term virtually because that was a request that I got often this past year about how do we tell our story virtually? What things can we do to keep our story of ministry alive and going? And so, though of course we are definitely focusing on the narrative budget, I thought it's a good idea to remind that the narrative budget is a piece of how you tell the story that Jonah was just referencing. It's not meant to be the only way you tell the story. It is to work in complement with everything else that's been covered today. Those letters and those little notes that Ellie spoke of earlier, the way that Stephen and Gail spoke of stewardship, et cetera, all of those things are connected in how we tell our story, and the narrative budget is just one piece of that. So definitely do that. And I didn't mean to leave Carl out. He definitely had some good tips as well about telling our story.
So here are the steps that we would use to go toward creating our first narrative budget. The first is to define your ministry areas: worship, outreach, education, fellowship, or more specific, maybe it's food pantry or preschool. And so find those areas of ministry. And we allocate staff time to each area. And then allocate all other resources proportionally to each area. And then we might even consider adding volunteer time to each area. And then after we do that, we want to write about the successes of the past year in each area. All of this is going to make sense in the upcoming slides. It's like, what are you talking about? Allocate what? And so again, these are words, but we're going to see in a moment the magic, if you will, and the amazing thing that happens when we're able to do this allocation in the narrative budget.
And before we get to that magical slide, I did want to say that, of course, with the narrative budget, it is something that, as you can see by doing the steps that Jonah just highlighted, it takes a little time, especially the first time that you tackle this. It is something that may or may not be familiar. You could have done line item budgeting for 50, 60, 70 years. And so now moving into this area might be a little daunting. And it might take more time to get used to this, getting your elders and other committee leaders used to being able to tell those stories and to be able to highlight the successes, et cetera. That's okay. All right. It's so okay that if it takes you a while, a couple of bumpy iterations to get that narrative budget going, the thing is to try it. The second thing that I would like to highlight is that the foundation is certainly here to help you as you begin this process. While the slides that follow are excerpts of a simplified way to begin this process, I would like to mention that we have within our Stewardship Navigator application ways to begin the narrative budget process in a step-by-step format. Within the Navigator, there is a way to basically answer questions, paste in descriptions of your ministry area and the stories that you would like to share. Unfortunately, it does not prevent you from doing the homework that Jonah has assigned to you. But once you've done that homework, it will help you format it. And it'll give you a great way to have a nice production of what a narrative budget would look like. So if you've not visited our Stewardship Navigator application, I would encourage you to do so. You may reach that at stewardshipnavigator.org. Pretty intuitive, and I'm sure somebody is typing that in chat. But if for any reason that you're unable to find that, definitely your ministry relations officer can help you with locating that navigator and, of course, with answering any questions about how to get started with a narrative budget. So, don't know how magic we're going to be this evening, but we're going to look at a very scaled down approach for a narrative budget. One thing I would like to say, and I think this came up earlier as well, we're going to focus in this example on how we can allocate the pastor's compensation across some ministry areas differently. Before we get started with that, I would like to say this method can be used and transferred to building maintenance, other types of personnel, anything of those categories that you may find helpful when you're allocating expenses. That goes back to that previous slide when you're making those steps. But we just wanted to show you how it would look like for just one position. Often the pastor in our congregation is the most significant personnel expense, which is why we started there. But if we aren't careful in a line item approach, the pastor salary takes such a large view of what we believe our expense is that it changes the story and the narrative. Folks are focusing on that number and less on what the pastor does. And we start imagining the pastor as a robot that comes in on Sundays and preaches a sermon and then turns right back off. Well, we know that is not the case. What a narrative is seeking to do is to take that pastor's compensation and allocate it over all of the areas that that pastor is working on to really tell that story differently and truthfully more accurately, so you can look at it and say, this really paints a picture for me of what my pastor is doing.
So I remember looking at this like, oh my. And like Olanda said, I couldn't get over the first part. And let's just say this is me in the example. And we're doing a congregational meeting and then people are staring at these numbers. And I know that no one's eyes will go past the first line without thinking, oh my gosh, he costs lots, or just that they're fixated on that single amount. But with the and as Olanda said, it changes the narrative. Instead of focusing on the good things that is happening, we just can't get over these numbers. And so in this example, the pastor's salary is 60,000. But what the narrative budget helps us to do is to ask ourselves, as a pastor, where do we spend our time in ministry? So very simply put, in this example, I determined that 35% of my time is spent in the worship ministry area, that I spend 25% of my time in outreach, 20% in Christian ed, and 20% in church community. Now, again, with this example, anyone's could go up and down and change all over the place. But for this example, this is how we determine we spend our time. And now that I've determined and identify where I spend my time, now we're able to figure out how much of my salary then can be allotted in these particular areas. And so again, as a pastor, the beauty and relief of this is that the congregation is not obsessing about the $60,000 salary. Just say, oh my gosh, it's such a huge percentage of our budget. The magic, if you will, or the relief in my case, happens in the next slide when you see what we do with it then.
Thank you, Jonah. One thing I would like to add is often when we are looking at the percentage allocation process, sometimes we can get stuck there. We can get stuck on, oh my gosh, how do I estimate the time, or how do I allocate, the percent of time that I've used? I need to have my pastor start keeping a weekly log of where he or she is spending the time, etc. That's not what we're saying. And if I could quote my favorite television judge, Judge Milian, she has a phrase on People's Court where she says, rough justice. It's so okay to do some rough justice to this, especially the first year out of the gate. When you're asking your pastor to estimate his or her time, it's okay to say that estimate might be it might be 36.5, or it could be, 34. That's okay, right? Because we're just trying to get a clearer picture. And as time goes on, again, you will get better at this process. And perhaps you will come up with different ways to capture that. But don't let that be a stumbling block for you to begin this process. So as Jonah mentioned, as far as the magic equation here, we're going to allocate some of those funds, some of the amount from the pastor's salary to those different categories using those percentages that Jonah mentioned in the previous slide. You will note here that when we do that, going back to that transparency thing, it is important for those amounts to tie. If you're going to have a line item budget and a narrative budget, and you probably should at least have another type outside of the narrative, whether it's a combo of the program or zero line, all of the above, or what have you, you need some way, again, for your finance folks and your session to look at those expenses, and whatever that budget comes up with, the narrative amount needs to tie to that. They're not amounts that are going to be different. And so this is more of an exercise to get that to be reflected more, to tell the story more accurately of how those expenses are actually used to come up with the budget. And so again, hypothetical example, this could be used for building, it can be used for other personnel, it can be used for your music ministry. With a music ministry, for instance, you may find that there are some areas that aren't as applicable. They may have more of their time in worship and perhaps Christian ed, and less in outreach or Christian community, because as a director of a choir or an organist, etc., they may or may not have the opportunity to be involved in those areas. And again, that's okay. It's just a matter of getting used to that process.
Again, a narrative budget is a representation, right? That's the definition. But when we see the next, I think there's the next one there, picture that can pop up. But when we see this narrative budget example, what we see is that this compared to a line item, the line item is a tool useful to those who have the skills to utilize it, but the narrative budget is accessible to anyone. we can visualize it and we can see the example right here. In our example, right here in front of us, we know that our congregation is invested in worship, outreach, and youth because we see the figures that are going into it. And we see we can have write-ups of the story, but it makes it very easy for people to see where and what our church believes in by what it's spending and investing in and what we're doing. And so that it's not just for the finance people, it's for this is our story. This is who we are given to us in this narrative budget.
Absolutely. And what many churches find helpful is to have something like a pie chart, as you see here, or some other type of graphical representation to show the relationship of the ministries with one another. Many find that helpful is that it will show at a quick glance where the energies of the church are weighted in terms of one another. There is no right or wrong answer in this exercise. It just tells you who you are and what your church is actually working with in its engagement ministry and its engagement to further the mission. And so this is just a way. You may find that a bar graph works better for you, or it could be literally a pie and less of the circular format. Whatever that is, it's definitely a way to present those numbers in a different way.
So when we look at the next steps for what we can do for the narrative budget, first thing is to define budget components of personnel. Then define the number of ministry areas that you want your church to tell stories about. Again, worship, mission, fellowship, music, etc. And for each area, make a list of stories. Who could tell this? Who could share the story, and how you could share the story. So we could do these things to prepare and move forward with this.
Then we come up with how we communicate this information. This relates to the transparency. Some will literally mail a copy of the narrative budget in their campaign season or during the stewardship pledge drive. Others will wait until it's time for a congregational meeting or other gathering where the budget is presented. That is something that you would have to, of course, figure out what works best for your context and your church and how your members would respond to that information. But I would like to say that when you're communicating, these are just some pointers. They can, of course, be different, and we're happy to discuss that with you as the MRO for your area. But try to have those communications personalized, less of the dear member and more of the dear Jonah So. Try to have those stories and your narrative budget connect with your mission. If you remember, before we even got started with the mathematical computations, we started with the what is your story? We started with the how and why do you tell your story? And that why dealt with connecting to your mission, connecting to your strategic plan. And so you can't lose sight of that. Your narrative is part of that story that you believe when you are answering those questions that defines who you are as a congregation. And so how does that connect when you are presenting the narrative to the church? How will investment make this work? How your investment of time, talent, and treasures will further us along this journey of bringing our ministry, bringing our dollars to life. If you're able to, when you're communicating that perhaps in a cover letter, you may do that differently. You may do that differently by generational trends or by past giving patterns. Often it's helpful to emphasize certain things to a different demographic group. Sometimes our younger generations, for instance, respond more to hearing how this ministry is really doing something to change the world or to make the world a better place, while perhaps our older generation is more concerned or would like to hear more about the institutionalism or the preservation of the church and how this is really holding true to what we've always done or been as a church in the community. You're definitely connecting that if you so choose to use a theme to your theme of your stewardship campaign. Again, your narrative is not a standalone thing that is not connected to the other areas of the church. You're including, as we've talked about before, the various ways to support the ministry, whether that is through time and talent, whether it's financial. And if it's financial, you're definitely including the ways to give to support that ministry, to support the narrative budget and the components that have been highlighted within that budget.
And as we've discussed the narrative budget, we want to try to do these things. As Olanda says, it's not a first time you're going to get it. You try all different iterations and you go with it and you do it. But we always want to keep the mind of the keys to success, which goes beyond just this preparation for the narrative budget. But we want to be, it's things you've heard, things you know, things you preach. Be prayerful, celebrate your church, right? And be visionary. Focus on your vision. Don't forget why we exist. Communicate. Involve many, get the buy-in of the people. Fund ministry, not raise funds. Be inviting, not threatening. Challenge your congregation. Again, these are not anything new that will blow your mind, but these are all parts of success that we want to keep in mind as we implement our budgeting.
And you know, I love it when a plan comes together. And so I could feel the spirit earlier when Stephen was presenting, because we shared this slide as well. And I thought that was so great because it was a way to begin our day and end our day with reminding us of the keys to be successful on our stewardship journey. And I love, this is also one of my favorite slides because it definitely roots us on this stewardship journey in prayer. Stephen began us earlier today with reminding us of the importance of rooting what we do in scripture, rooting what we do in prayer. I'm hoping that you're hearing in our presentation today that the basis of whatever budget type that you use is the ministry. The basis of what you are doing here is really communicating with others how your ministry is making a difference. And so please remember that it's tempting to get frustrated when you're dealing with the budgeting process. I know, truthfully, I do when I'm working with my own congregation's budget. But as I'm doing that, I remember this is good stuff because we are really helping our members understand this is how we take our numbers and really show this is how we are working together as a church to further the ministry. So that will actually bring us, if I'm not mistaken, to our question slide. And I know my colleague Maggie has probably answered all of the questions for us. So it's only a formality that we have this here, but just in case there might be some, Maggie, I'll look to you to see what we can do to try to answer those.
Thank you, Olanda. And I was going to say, nice try, but I have a lot of questions for you, for the two of you. A lot of great questions have come in, so we're going to make you stay on for a little bit longer. I know it's late for you both on the East Coast, but do you want to address some of these? There were a number of questions that, before I do that, I forgot to thank these fabulous gentlemen. So let's all pick the reaction of your choice and give them a visual thank you for everything that they've just shared with us, which was absolutely fantastic. So thank you both. And now, before you get too comfortable with that, let me get some questions to you. One of the things that I saw, both that were emailed to me and that came in the chat, were questions about how you deal with endowments in your budget. So endowments, of course, being permanent funds that produce a certain amount of income every year that is a distribution to the church. One of the questions was, does that sit as a separate category? Do we use that to supplement? How do we deal with that? Because we don't want to take away from other giving to that category, but we know it's out there. So can the two of you talk a little bit about how to integrate endowment income into your annual budget?
Absolutely. I'm sure Jonah probably has some firsthand experience, but before I let him speak to that, I would say that you definitely look at the purpose of the fund or the funds in some cases. And of course, you have to honor that or be true to what those funds are to be used for. Often income earned, often investment, or income from an endowment can be used for certain areas of the budget. I mentioned very briefly as we went through today, sources of income. And what most do, you have obviously, which is generally the largest source, is coming from your member giving or your membership giving. But other sources of income often come from income earned off investments, income earned off of endowments. How that is used, either it's governed in some cases by the bylaws of the church and how they have identified that. In some endowments, of course, it is determined at the time the endowment is created by those that created the endowment. But whatever it is, use it in the way that it has been designed to be used as a source of income. If it can offset a part of the budget based on that, that's okay. It just allows other dollars to be freed up to do other areas of ministry. It definitely needs to be communicated in that type of way, because if we're not careful, it can be used as a distraction from annual giving. And so your members would be encouraged we now have the opportunity to use other dollars in other areas of ministry because we have income earned from this area to perhaps support this type of area of the church, whether it's Christian ed or scholarship, et cetera. Jonah, have you worked with that in your congregations at all, or?
So yeah, I mean, in terms of what you just shared, I echo all that. I wanted to just chime in the sense of like adding to the narrative of what it is. With the endowments, with the planned givings and things like this that we have, just the ability to kind of remind ourselves that we're here because of those who were before us that made it happen. That kind of and so to add that into the narrative of what's happening in our congregation, why we are here. Maybe when I actually heard endowment, I was thinking more along the lines of planned giving, legacy. So actually now as I'm speaking, I'm a little bit like, oh wait, I'm not answering the question of actual endowment, but I'm thinking how the endowment got there along those ways. I just anecdotally, I just remember the powerful story for me was people who were at church their whole lives gave so faithfully. And then when they passed, like there's no more proof, if you will, no legacy to show how much they cared about the congregation, about their community. And that is something where to me, when I think of planned giving / the endowment, how beautiful the story is and where we are because of that. And it continues on in sort of perpetuity. And what a great, amazing way of thinking about the cloud of witnesses that we are with. And so that's just something I wanted to share with regard to that. Sorry for misunderstanding the question initially, though.
Oh no, that is perfect. I think it's always good for that reminder of why we share the story and the importance of planned giving and legacy speak within our congregations. And you are exactly right. That is why we do it. And so I thank you for sharing that.
I would actually add as well to that there's an opportunity in your budgeting, if you have endowment income coming in, to have that as a line or as an acknowledgement, so that it's not just the treasurer or not just the finance team who knows that these endowments exist, but that you're communicating that part of the budget is coming from the church ancestors, the people who have come before and who are still spiritually supporting and participating in the church. I really encourage people to find a way to include that in the language of their budget so that more people can celebrate that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of pick up on the other side of the endowment question, which is, you've got money coming in there. A couple people asked, when you talked about, and really like that language at the beginning, and the sort of the basic reminder that sometimes we forget, don't spend more money than you have. Like that's the basics of budgeting. But the question was, okay, so what does that mean though for smaller churches that have diminishing membership for whatever variety of reasons? and you know that you're projecting a loss because your expenses have been fairly fixed, but your income is decreasing. What are your recommendations for, as you're doing your budgeting, how to start looking at and having some of those hard conversations around what you stop doing or how you change what you're doing?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And at least I hope I said earlier that there are going to be times where you're going to find yourself in that situation. It doesn't mean if you have a year or perhaps one or two or more years where you're in a deficit or your expenses are less than your income, and you may be more heavily relying on reserve spending, et cetera, to make things meet or balance. But the point that we were making earlier is that's not a sustainable way to be. And that if you find yourself in that situation, and I think, Maggie, what I'm hearing is, we need to start engaging in those conversations of this is not a sustainable way to do it. Now, granted, there are all kinds of deficits. It could be a minus $100 deficit. Okay, that's something that we can easily tweak. We can reduce an expense here. We can look at ways to cut expenses in our budget. And that is where, when I said earlier, why you have line item information available. I'm never advocating that you get rid of that, because there always are opportunities of how we can be more prudent with our income and our expenses. But when you start having sizable deficits year over year, you do have to look at what can we do differently? What are those things? And often we are able to help you with that at the foundation, and working with your ministry relations officer. We're able to have those conversations with you, perhaps give you ideas of what other churches have done in those cases. I wish I could tell you one answer that would work, but often that is something that varies case by case. There are things that could be used or recommended to provide relief in those areas, but that definitely changes on the scenario of the church versus another church. So I guess the shortest answer would be, if you are in that situation, to definitely contact your regional ministry relations officer and get that conversation started.
Jonah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, tackling the question with the focusing on the things that you brought up, Maggie, and with regard to diminishing congregational membership, and just tackling the hard questions. I'm just amazed at how a narrative budget would allow a congregation to boldly tackle, maybe we're done. Now, I'm taking it from the perspective of not a hopeless way, but given that it's been diminishing, given that it's kind of not bouncing back, not technical stuff that's going to fix for the year, but it's been a big trend. When you have a narrative budget, we can celebrate the history of where we've been, and maybe now it's the time that we've done good, and now it's done. Like, again, no one wants to say that kind of question. I never want to have that kind of conversation, but maybe the narrative budget opens up the possibility to look at it, rather than looking at a bunch of numbers that are cold and meaningless unless you know how to read them. A narrative budget celebrating all that has been gone on, and now we've come to our end, and we could celebrate all the good that has been done, and we're the ones who will kind of close this up. And if forgive me for not recalling, but I think in A Book of Order and the Foundations of Faith, one of the lines that really speak to me is like, not afraid to die. Mm-hmm. Not afraid of that. Not afraid to even be faithful to even to our detriment and death. That kind of message, and to be able to integrate that faithfulness to God even at the end. To me, narrative budget allows that to happen. And again, we don't hope that it's there, but sometimes we know that's the reality. And as you mentioned, hard conversation. Narrative budget gives us meat and a good stories and understanding to kind of engage with those kinds of questions. I don't mean to be morbid, but I mean that's kind of the reality that I see and the hope that I see in the narrative budget, to be able to tackle that.
Yeah, thank you. And I would just affirm to you, I don't think that that's morbid. It is a conversation that that in my role I get to have with churches. It is a difficult conversation, but I think that as you see diminishing income and diminishing membership, that sometimes, we were talking about endowment before, or investment income. Sometimes there's ways of hiding the fact that there's now an opportunity to live differently as a church, to move through a transformation and really to create new opportunities. And I think that a lot of churches, as we're talking about this in terms of budgeting, you have to maybe go through some grieving, but you have to go through that in order to get to the other side of it. So I think that that's really important. And thank you for raising that in that way. I want to ask a couple of a little bit more tactical questions for you guys. There were some questions about, how do you practically balance, or what are some tools for the ongoing maintenance needs of your church against wanting to do capital improvements and larger capital campaigns and those sort of exciting expenditures that you can get people behind? It seems a lot harder to get people behind we need a new roof or there's termite damage campaign than there is to say we're going to build a new sanctuary. So do you have some thoughts on that for how you build that into the financial conversation people are having?
Sure. It is definitely a challenge. There are challenges with the ongoing maintenance. That's not very exciting when you're looking at the other areas of ministry. But what I like to remind or encourage our churches to think about is to think about what our building allows us to do, the types of ministry that we are able to have or to hold within the walls of our sanctuary or fellowship hall, et cetera, that if our roof is leaking or the termites have taken the doorway, we're not able to do those types of ministry. And so really bringing it back. I think now I'm at the 60th time I'm saying this, but folks give to ministry, right? And so the answer always lies in ministry. And if we're looking at it at a word problem thing and you're taking an exam and that's the problem that's presented to you, you're going to start with, I know the answer is in ministry. Now, how do I tell it? And so that's always where you start. And so whether it's building maintenance, annual expenses, personnel, what have you, it is always going to start with the ministry. And how do we reframe this about the ministry of the church? I'm not denying that it may be a challenge for a roof, but I still stand by that is the best way to do that. And again, we are more than happy to help our congregations with those types of conversations within our respective areas.
Piggybacking off of Olanda and reframing and giving to ministry, I would say conversationally, tactically, and bringing it in is the sense of, I really believe in this ministry of space creation, creating sacred space for God to work, right? I mean, we hear variations of this. We can plant, we can water, but we can't make it grow. And so we can't make growth happen. That's on God. But what we can do is create the space for God to grow. And so to me, that ministry of space creation falls in line with, yes, the people are the church, right? It's not the building is the church, but the building is a place where ministry and God's work could really happen powerfully. And so when we just engage in the ministry of space creation, virtually or physically, to me, that is meaningful. That people want to get to be a part of generating life, generating good work, and by maintaining the church, the building. It's not sexy or glamorous, but when you reframe it, it's so worthy and hefty. And so I think that when we reframe it for people to understand, and again, it's just variation of Olanda's give to ministry. It's ministry happening, the ministry of space creation. And when we reframe it like that, it's not about painting walls and patching roofs. It's about making sure that we can have a space for God to do something pretty darn amazing in someone's life, in our community's life. And so that I very much agree with Olanda, and that's how I would approach that.
Jonah, I love that. I love that word space creation, that phrase space creation. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I so often hear, the idea that you have to let go and you have to make space in order for something to come in. So I see that in that way, and it really resonates for me. I'm going to ask a crowdsourced question, and then I'm going to have one more question for our presenters before we close. But my crowdsourced question to everybody who is still on and can respond in the chat, we had a couple questions saying, what budget software do you recommend? I don't know the answer to that, but I bet that there are a lot of people on here who have recommendations for what they're using as budget software. So now's a good chance to take advantage of your colleagues. Please chat into everyone if you have a budgeting software that you use that you think is really terrific. The last question I have for Olanda and Jonah is, and I thought that this was a really interesting question, but the person who asked it framed it as, the finance team sometimes doesn't want to do a narrative budget and doesn't want to talk too much about how much we have, because there's some fear that if we talk about how much we have, people won't want to give. So how do you feel about that? Don't tell them that it's okay, because what happens if we say we're okay? And how might that being too positive create negativity?
I love that question. I'm chuckling because I've been Presbyterian forever and a day, and so I can definitely relate to that question from my own context. And so it's causing me chuckle as I'm hearing members in my head perhaps saying similar things. But the first thing I would say, it definitely just reinforces that scarcity mentality that we must overcome. We must work against the being too afraid to speak of God's goodness because people will stop giving. We have to overcome that. If possible, I think the best way to overcome that or to work with that dynamic is to separate the functions. I don't think the finance team would be the best place for the narrative budget creation in most cases. There are some finance folks who can do that wonderfully. But what many churches find helpful is to have a little subset, having that generosity stewardship team, having that be their focus. And truthfully, they're not even going to get bogged down with the spreadsheets and the QuickBooks, things that they know that the chat room is popping up with. But the stewardship group is going to focus more on what we're talking about here, the messaging of how we do it. I said earlier in the presentation that the narrative budget is often a complement to another type of budgeting. So the finance team perhaps, would continue with that other type, that line item type, that zero program hybrid type, et cetera. But the narrative, the storytelling collection, how we reframe our dollars to be about ministry, the allocation processes, et cetera, would most likely be done by the folks who work with stewardship and generosity. If you're able to do that with the amount of membership in your church, that is the approach that I recommend. If that is a challenge to you, and having the, maybe one or two folks of the finance team being able to do that, if your membership doesn't allow a separate subgroup. And I would like to remind again of the Stewardship Navigator. The Stewardship Navigator can certainly help with that compilation and can make that as simple as possible. The Navigator was designed originally for our smaller congregations, and while all can use it, it is definitely there to help our smaller membership congregations who perhaps can't have a robust stewardship committee to do the things that I am describing, but it can do so much for you to help you outline those things. And so again, in summary, committee if you can do it. If you can't do a committee, try to at least get one or two people and really get into that Navigator.
Yeah, going from your identifying how we typically go from the scarcity mentality, that totally sounds like in the situation that Maggie gives to us, it's time for them to dream dreams. they did a great job maintaining it. And then I'm sure that, again, we always did it this way. And now if we have surplus and things are good, it's time to grow. No, it's time to get creative and get excited that now we have resources to put it into more generative opportunities and ministries. And because people want to keep giving to something that's good, right? I mean, in the previous sessions, we were seeing that people want to know that they're giving to success. They love the growth story, and so you know, that's oh, do we tell them? Otherwise, you're gonna stop giving. That's total scarcity, and we just want to be small, and we're not growing anyway. Like that non-growing mentality. And so for me, that triggers a very. I love your suggestion of there's finance and then there's stewardship, and often they're finance and stewardship together. But maybe it's time to dream in a different way and let others in the room to take these numbers and grow them in a narrative and a ministry way. And so that's what I'm hearing there. And so that's a great problem that we can reframe and be happy about it. Yeah, that sounds very exciting, actually, if that's the case.
Well, on that note, let's just give a huge, huge thank you to Jonah and Olanda, who were with us all day and then who gave us this wonderful presentation at the end of the day and so many fantastic resources. Thank you, Jonah and Olanda. It was absolutely fantastic. I learned a lot listening to the two of you. So thank you very much for that. Just a quick reminder before we close that all of these sessions have been recorded. We will make them available. You will get a link by email in the next few days. It's probably going to take us a few days to put everything together, so be patient with us. But you will get a link to all of these. So you'll have that as a resource coming out of this. You can, again, always reach out to your ministry relations officer, because that's what we're here for. This is what we love doing, is working with our churches and supporting you in your growth and in your journey. I would like to close as we started the day by asking Glenn Bell, the Presbyterian Foundation, to send us out today with a prayer. Glenn?
Siblings in Christ, let's pray together. Gracious God, we give you thanks for mission, for vision, for ministry. We give you thanks in these closing moments for the congregation of which we are a part, for the faces and the hearts, and for the heart of it all, your Son, Jesus Christ. That's the reason, oh God, that's the reason we have been on these Zooms today, even through our COVID weariness. That's the reason we want to learn more about virtual stewardship campaigns and online giving and church budgeting. God, that's the reason we give thanks for Maggie and Stephen and Gail, for Ellie and Carl, for Jonah and Olanda. That's the reason that we are grounded in your joy. The joy that brings us in and leads us out yet once again to lead and to serve and to offer our very best to the glory of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.